mascara. So I've been promising this for a long time, sort of a post-mortem of Theranos, even though the company's not truly dead yet. Kind of what happened, what lessons can be learned, a little bit of entertainment, and how to spot stuff like this. Some of the warning signs that are obviously somewhat obvious in hindsight, but it's the company was sort of an implausible company to begin with. Lab companies and entrepreneurs and innovators in general have tried for a very, very long time to get rid of the amount of blood that needs to be drawn in a test. Nobody likes giving blood, and testing requires so much blood that it really is kind of a big potential moonshot to lower the amount of blood required. But there is a reason that we don't need a lancet. There's a reason that we have to do vials, and that finger sticks and a few drops isn't enough to do the test. And if you've ever gone to give blood for a test, the number of vials that you have to fill up for this stuff is really remarkable. Someone's saying 4 tubes or 13 tubes, and it's this enormous amount of blood. And so obviously we'd all like to lower the amount of blood we'd have to give, but the idea that we can jump from tubes and tubes and vials of blood to none, I think was somewhat implausible, and that should have raised enough worry that the investment didn't make a lot of sense. I mean, I invest in a lot of new fangled technology, but I like to kind of wait to see that it works first. And I think that this was sort of a big issue. Anyway, the next question is the value. So this is the most important part of all, which is, maybe Theranos is a good investment at a 50 million valuation or 100 million valuation. Generally, companies like this don't go for a lot because most of the value in healthcare is in pharmaceuticals. When the company starts selling shares for $9 billion, when LabCorp and Quest are trading for 16 and 14 billion, and LabCorp has merged their way, they have lab business now. So the actual, they're trading as if they're already the leading lab provider, even though they don't do any lab tests. It sort of reminds me of Tesla, where Tesla is trading as if they were as big as GM and shipping as many cars as GM. Which again, maybe they'll grow into, maybe they won't. But Tesla actually does make working cars, whereas Theranos didn't even have evidence of making working lab tests. So anyway, when you have a high market cap like that, there's a lot of problems. I mean, one, it's fun to for a minute, to say that you have a big market cap, because on paper you're worth zillions of dollars and so forth. But there's a lot of problems with that. The first is that you have very high expectations, right? So when you have a billion market cap, or a 5 billion market cap, or a 10 billion market cap as a private company, you're really asking for trouble, because you have to make your investors happy. The person that buys shares of your company at a 10 billion valuation, say they put $100 million in for just 1% of your company, that would make it a $10 billion valuation. You have to somehow make that person money, and you're responsible for them. And if the market cap goes to 20 billion, you've doubled their money, which for a venture investment is okay, I suppose. But that's a big company you have to make from 10 billion to 20 billion. A lot of companies struggle to do that for decades. They stay in that $10 billion range. So again, you might say, who cares about the investor? But I think it's very important to give your investors a good deal. Again, I started my companies for 5 to 30 million pre-money valuations. And I'm sure the first round of Theranos might have been somewhere in that range, but it really is kind of crazy to ask your investors to pay $9 billion for your shares. So there's a lot of pressure to meet those high expectations, and it may lead into some bad behavior, like Elisabeth Holmes, the dropout actually, starting to fake and defraud people. If she had a 50 million market cap, she could just tell people, well, look, we hit a stumbling block and we need another year or two to figure this out, and tell the truth. But with a 9 billion market value, she has to maybe have that pressure, that extra pressure to lie, and that pressure to meet those high expectations. So of course the success is just not that rewarding at 9 billion. You can make the biggest lab company in the world, and your investors still may not make much money. And then your stock, if it falls, the investor is taking pretty much all downside. So the marginal upside is not that useful. That's the reason that I keep my valuations low because, okay, say you own half a company and you sell the other half, say it's a 10 million valuation. So you own 100% of it when it's worth 10 million, you sell half of it for $10 million to other investors. Now you have 10 million in the bank and you still own half the company. Well, that's still a lot. I mean, if it becomes a $1 billion company off your 10 million, which obviously you'll need more and more capital, but you can be worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and you at least your investors will make a lot of money, and you don't have these huge expectations. But if you start raising money for billions of dollars, I'm sure I could convince somebody to buy shares in a new company for $1 billion, but it wouldn't end well because even if I did amazingly, I would return very little to my shareholders, and it's sort of greedy. So I think that's sort of the issue. The other obvious thing here is there was fraud, and I want to talk about this for a little bit because I think that. One of the things that I like to do when I invest, both private and public, is I like to actually do my own tests, which is really a crazy thing to be able to do. So if I look at a drug and a company says that, let's say it has an inhibitory constant of 5 nanomolars, it's a very, very potent product for an enzyme, let's say. It's a small molecule drug. Well, I'm not just going to take the company who's selling to me's word for it. Why can't I just do the study myself? And so that obviously costs a lot of money, but we did one study at Turing that ended up saving us millions, and I have to thank Dr. Brockman, one of my great colleagues, for doing it. We were going to spend $3 million on a license to buy a medicine, and he said, let me just do one experiment. Before we spend the $3 million, and I was ready to kind of write the check. And he said, no, let me do this one experiment. I said, well, how much will the experiment cost? He said, it's like $30,000 or $80,000, I forget exactly. Not a small amount. And we get so used to when we're doing due diligence to not spend very much. But a $30,000 experiment ended up saving a $3 million license. And we avoided we looked at the experimental results. I said, you're right, Adam, this would have been a waste of $3 million. So we got out of doing that deal, and we ended up saving, we spent $30,000, but we saved $2.9 million. And so I think that when you can do some of these tests yourself, and you ask the company, you say, if you want my $10 million and a $9 billion value, or you want my $100 million, okay, let me sign a confidentiality agreement. I'd like to see it for myself. I'd like you to take blood from my finger, do a finger prick, get a few drops, and run your tests, and I'm going to go to my own clinic, do 10 vials of blood, and then run them on a Siemens analyzer, and I want to see who gets it right. And if you did that, then you can convince me that you can sort of do it for real. So that's a small example of kind of what I would do. But the rest of the signs that were kind of interesting is this really weird board of directors where they didn't have one lab person. If I'm building a company like Theranos, I want all lab experts. And I understand when I started drug companies, it was really hard to get board members. But I happen to get one pharma expert on my pharmaceutical company's board. It sort of makes sense. She didn't have one person who was an experienced lab person. And the lab industry is a big industry. There's a ton of people in the lab business. And finding one of them to join your board shouldn't be that hard. But getting a lot of people like Henry Kissinger, Henry Kissinger's a famous guy, but he's better for, the board of a museum or the board of a university, not the board of a lab testing company. Finally, all the patents have Elisabeth Holmes's name on them. Not all of them, but I'd say the majority of them. And I reviewed a bunch of the patents, and I just want to show you guys kind of how I would do the diligence on this. So I went to PatFT, which is the USPTO's website. I typed in Theranos, and I went to assignee name. Patents are assigned to a company, and you can see all the patents that they've filed. Now, a bunch of these are not patents, so it turns out that they have around 75-ish patents, and I read a bunch of them. You can see that I've read a bunch of them with the ones that have been clicked. I read all of the early patents, that some of them are just by Elisabeth Holmes. A lot of these people left the company. I'll tell you the story in a second. So, anyway, when you're looking at a technology, you don't look at the results, you look at the cause. So the results are this idea that you could do a few drops of blood. But I think that if you look at the patent, 9677993, this is systems and methods for sample use maximization. So I'd like to actually look into the how. How do they do this? And you have to write, in the United States, you have to patent your invention. Why do you have to do it? Well, it's sort of hard to run your company without patenting the invention. Now, you might not patent everything about your invention in there and keep some trade secrets, but patents are a sure way to sort of look at sort of ways to sort of think about a technology. So anyway, I looked at this patent, and it looked kind of like a pretty important patent because it says systems and methods for sample use maximization. And isn't it the whole point is that samples, you want to be able to maximize their use. In other words, maybe a couple drops of blood could be usable instead of a whole vial. And the spoiler here is that you can read this patent, but there's nothing in there about maximizing this stuff, maximizing the sample. So the patent's got 5 people on it, and Nugent, Young, Holmes, Siegel, and Wistort. And I actually looked up their backgrounds. So Siegel and Wistort are robotics guys. They don't have any PhD level education. They don't have any chemistry or biology training. They're just robotics guys. They do robotics stuff for tech companies. And if you look at their LinkedIns, they refuse to acknowledge that they ever worked at Theranos, which is pretty crazy. Dr. Young is an MIT mechanical engineering guy, but there's no evidence that he's ever really done any work for a healthcare company, which is pretty important. Healthcare is a very different part of engineering, and it's a very specific specialty. Not Dr. Nugent, Mr. Nugent, does have some lab testing experience, but it really doesn't rise to the level of being an inventor. So who here is the brainiac? I'm having a really hard time figuring that out, and that's pretty important. So anyway, the patent looks like this, and this may look like a bunch of tough-to-read gibberish for you, but I'm going to sort of break it down very slowly, and this is sort of the way I look at it. Most of the stuff in a patent or in any other technical document can be broken down if you just do it slowly. And if you try to read Claim 1, and Claim 1 is always the most important claim in a patent, it really doesn't make sense. It is a lot of gibberish and it's tough to understand, but here's how I looked at it. A method for handling a sample comprising of a cartridge, and the cartridge contains the sample, and the sample has a volume of 200 microliters or less, and there's an instrument where the cartridge is in the instrument, and the instrument has a centrifuge, which has a bucket of some kind, and then there's a pipette with a nozzle. Okay, so that's sort of what we've got here. This is their invention. So what does that look like? Well, I did my best to draw it, and so this is the instrument, which is the green box. There's the cartridge, which goes in the instrument. That's the red box. The sample is this yellow-orange colored sample that's in the cartridge, according to the patent. There's a little pipette and a centrifuge here. The pipette has a nozzle, and the cartridge has these tips, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the pipette has a nozzle, and the cartridge contains the first tip and the second tip and a tip seal. So there's the tips again. The tips are the pink triangles. Okay, but the tips each have a first open end and a second open end, which are these little stars that I drew, blue and green. Okay, so the tips have. So again, the important thing here is that you look at this and you say, okay, well, this looks like a normal patent, but you actually have to stop and read it really carefully. And when you read it really carefully, you sort of become surprised. So let's keep going. So the tips have open ends, and the open end of each tip engages with the nozzle of the pipette. So the pipette basically dips itself into these things, and that's all that really happens. And it permits the movement of fluid in or out of the tip. So this guy jumps in there and sucks out the fluid. So you insert the pipette, and when it's full, it inserts the pipette into the centrifuge, which sort of makes sense. So it's pretty simple here. The pipette has its nozzle. It goes into the tip, takes the fluid out of the tip, and then puts it into the centrifuge. And there's my cat, Trashy. So it's pretty simple. There's nothing surprising about this. In fact, we do this every day. If you've ever filled a well, 96 well plate, for instance, you take a pipette. I have a pipette in the closet, in fact. You can pipette out some liquid, and you put it into a centrifuge, and that's a very, very normal, kind of way to do an experiment. And there's nothing really fancy about it. But this is their patent, and again, claim 1 is always the most important claim. And this is not, an invention. This is really far from an invention, and a totally unimportant invention. So if you look at all Theranos' patents, I don't really see what part of it is so special and different from LabCorp and other companies. So the rest of you might say, well, that's unfair. The rest of the claims are interesting. Well, claim 2 is where the sample comes from a finger stick. But that's not an invention. That could be saying, well, the sample comes from Mars. I mean, who cares where the sample comes from? The question is, why is this thing a cool invention? And then it says, okay, so when you centrifuge the sample separates into a supernatant and a pellet. Well, that's exactly what a centrifuge does. There's nothing special about that at all. And then the next claim is that the sample goes from, the pipette, and you can move it to the other tip. Again, this is basic mechanics. Then the supernatant has blood or serum. That's not an invention. There's nothing special about the fact that the supernatant is blood. If you put blood is the sample, that's what's going to happen. So the next claim is amazingly that you use that blood to do an assay, which again is the whole point of having a machine like this. And then finally, the next claim is the pellet that comes from the supernatant has blood cells in it, which again is really, really unimportant. Claim 8 is you taking a picture, an imaged portion of the tip that contains the pellet so you can determine the hematocrit. There's nothing special about that. Claims 9 and 10 are just taking the pellets and running more tests on them. This is what their drawing looks like. I don't know that they've ever made one of these. I think they call it their mini lab now. This is the tip with a nozzle and all that. So in any event, this is sort of an analysis of their patents, and really not so innovative and interesting, and definitely not worth $9 billion. So anyway, it was all kind of obvious. In hindsight, I would have shorted the stock. In fact, I tried to short Theranos. Hard to short shares of a private company, but it is doable. So anyway, that's the postmortem on Theranos.